In 1871, Darwin noted that the Neanderthal skull was well developed and capacious, a quiet warning that these ancient humans were not simple brutes, but large-brained people misunderstood by later science. Krapina sits in a narrow valley in northern Croatia, beneath a sandstone cliff called Husnjak Hill, and even now the place feels strange. The valley narrows sharply, the cave shelter opens across a steep slope, and the entire location carries the feeling of a funnel where animals and people repeatedly gathered over immense spans of time. In 1899, Dragutin Gorjanović Kramberger arrived at the site after local people uncovered unusual fossil bones while quarrying sand from the hill. What began as a routine examination quickly transformed into one of the most astonishing discoveries in the history of human evolution. Human bones emerged everywhere from the deposits, mixed among cave bear, rhinoceros, deer, wolf, and other Ice Age animals. Teeth appeared in such numbers that Gorjanović Kramberger immediately understood he was not dealing with a single skeleton or even a family burial. The hill contained an entire vanished population. One detail from those early reports still carries enormous force today because it captures the shock of the discovery before later scientific categories softened its impact. Gorjanović Kramberger wrote of an extraordinary abundance of human bones and emphasized that the material represented a large ancient community rather than isolated accidental finds. He also described the remains as displaying remarkable variability, a phrase that quietly destabilized the simplistic image of Neanderthals that later entered popular culture. The fossils from Krapina did not fit into a neat category. Some skull fragments appeared massively built with heavy brow ridges and thick cranial walls, while others looked comparatively light and almost modern in certain proportions. Some jaws appeared extremely robust, while others possessed surprisingly reduced features. Even the teeth varied strongly in size and shape. Something did not quite fit with the idea of a fixed, isolated species existing apart from later humans. That problem became even larger as the excavations continued. Between 1899 and 1905, Gorjanović Kramberger recovered material from roughly 70 to 80 individuals, creating one of the largest collections of Neanderthal fossils ever uncovered. The sheer scale of the assemblage remains staggering even now. Many famous ancient human discoveries involve a skull, a jaw, or scattered fragments from 2 or 3 individuals. Krapina instead produced an entire population spread across different ages and body types. Children, adolescents, adults, and elderly individuals appeared within the deposits. Some individuals possessed heavily worn teeth and signs of aging, others died young. The site therefore offered something rare in paleoanthropology, not a symbolic representative of an ancient people, but a cross-section through a living community. The timing of the site made the discovery even more important. Krapina dates to roughly 130,000 years ago, during the warm interglacial period between severe glacial phases. Europe at that time looked radically different from the frozen landscape commonly associated with Neanderthals. Forests expanded across much of the continent, temperatures rose, rivers widened, and large animals flourished in rich environments. The people living at Krapina were not desperate survivors trapped in icy wastelands. They occupied a productive landscape filled with game, woodland resources, and flowing water. This matters because it destroys another persistent myth surrounding Neanderthals, the idea that they represented an evolutionary dead end, adapted only to harsh, cold conditions. Krapina instead reveals a population thriving during one of the most favorable climatic intervals of the late Pleistocene. Yet the cave also carries a darker reputation, one that scholars often describe cautiously despite the extraordinary evidence. Human bones from Krapina display cut marks, breakage patterns and fragmentation that strongly suggest deliberate processing of bodies. Some skull fragments contain slicing marks associated with defleshing. Certain jaws display cuts near muscle attachment zones. Long bones were broken open. Burn marks appear on some material. Even early investigators recognized the disturbing implications. Gorjanović Kramberger himself struggled with the interpretation because the evidence pointed toward behavior that challenged civilized assumptions about human ancestry. Later scholars attempted softer explanations involving ritual handling of the dead, secondary burial practices, or complex mortuary behavior. Yet the site retains an undeniable atmosphere of violence and bodily destruction. Krapina resembles not a peaceful cemetery, but a shattered accumulation of human bodies repeatedly broken apart. This becomes more unsettling when combined with the enormous number of individuals represented in the deposits. The assemblage does not look like a single catastrophe. Instead, the cave accumulated human material over repeated episodes. Some researchers interpret the site as evidence for ritual cannibalism. Others interpret it as evidence of nutritional cannibalism during periods of stress. Another possibility emerges from the broader context of Neanderthal social life itself. Krapina belonged to a world of small territorial populations scattered across Europe during fluctuating climatic cycles. Groups likely competed intensely for hunting grounds, shelter zones, and seasonal movement corridors. Violence between human populations was therefore not unusual, but fundamental to survival. Krapina preserves traces of that world with brutal clarity. At the same time, the site reveals behavior that appears strikingly human in another direction entirely. Among the most famous discoveries from Krapina are eagle talons carrying cut marks and polishing traces. These talons originated from white-tailed eagles and were clearly manipulated by human hands. The marks indicate suspension, handling, and repeated contact. The objects formed some type of ornament, bracelet, necklace, or symbolic item. Their age matters enormously because they appear long before modern Homo sapiens entered Europe. The implication is unavoidable. Symbolic behavior, personal decoration, and abstract social signaling already existed among Neanderthal populations far earlier than once believed. That realization transforms the meaning of Krapina. The cave no longer represents a primitive side branch of humanity. Instead, it reveals a deeply human population displaying social symbolism, territorial behavior, violence, variation in body form, and sophisticated adaptation to changing environments. The old image of Neanderthals as dim, uniform cave dwellers collapses under the sheer complexity of the evidence. Even Gorjanovich Kramberger sensed this more than a century ago. He repeatedly emphasized the variability within the fossils and argued that evolution itself generated the diversity visible among the bones. In other words, he recognized something many later popular reconstructions ignored. Krapina did not preserve a separate creature standing outside humanity. It preserved humans in transition. That idea has returned in recent years through genetics, particularly through the work of David Reich and other ancient DNA researchers. Reich proposed that Neanderthals were not an entirely separate lineage existing outside modern humanity, but rather a branch of ancient Homo sapiens populations that later absorbed genetic input from another archaic Eurasian population related to Heidelberg groups around 250,000 years ago. Under this framework, Neanderthals carried ancestry that was overwhelmingly sapiens-related, combined with a smaller but significant component from older Eurasian populations. Reich described this process as roughly a 95% to 5% mixture. The exact percentages remain debated, yet the broader implication is profound. Neanderthals ceased to appear as alien beings diverging from humanity in deep isolation. Instead, they emerge as part of a constantly mixing network of ancient human populations spread across Africa and Eurasia. Krapina suddenly becomes central within that larger picture, because the fossils visibly display the kind of variation expected from mixture and population interaction. Some individuals retain highly archaic cranial traits, while others possess features closer to later humans. Certain skull fragments display long, low cranial shapes with strong brow ridges, yet other pieces reveal surprisingly rounded vaults and lighter facial construction. The variation exceeds what many researchers once expected within a single, isolated species. This explains why Krapina generated so much confusion among early anatomists. The fossils refused to conform to a fixed racial category. They looked transitional because they genuinely belonged to populations shaped by repeated interaction and mixture across immense spans of time. The timing of Krapina strengthens this interpretation even further. Around 130,000 years ago, Eurasia entered a period of expanding human movement during the warm interglacial climate. Populations spread through corridors connecting southeastern Europe, the Near East, and Western Asia. Forests expanded northward. Rivers and coastal plains opened migration routes. Human groups that had once been isolated during colder phases encountered one another again. The result was not a simple replacement of one species by another, but a mosaic of interaction zones stretching across continents. Krapina sat directly within one of those zones. Even the physical placement of the cave supports this interpretation. Northern Croatia lies at a natural crossroads between the Balkans, Central Europe, and the Adriatic region. Human populations moving along river valleys or following animal herds would naturally pass through the region repeatedly. Krapina therefore occupied a strategic ecological corridor linking different populations together. This helps explain why the fossils display such strong internal diversity. The people living there did not exist at the edge of the world. They occupied one of the great crossroads of Ice Age Europe. One overlooked detail from the early excavations becomes especially important here. Gorjanović-Kramberger observed that the bones came from different layers and conditions within the deposit rather than a single tightly clustered burial horizon. The cave accumulated material across repeated occupations and events. This means the Krapina population did not represent one isolated family group. Instead, the fossils likely preserve generations of people using the shelter across changing seasons and climatic conditions. Over time, the cave became a repository of an entire regional population network. The physical anthropology emerging from Krapina also creates another problem for simplistic evolutionary narratives. Many modern descriptions present Neanderthals as highly specialized, cold-adapted people with rigid anatomy distinct from Homo sapiens. Yet, Krapina individuals live during a warm interval and display broad variability rather than extreme specialization. Some faces appear strongly projecting, while others possess flatter mid-facial regions. Some individuals display immense muscle attachment areas, while others appear comparatively gracile. The variation resembles what one would expect inside a widespread, interconnected human population rather than a narrow evolutionary dead end. Ancient DNA findings from other Neanderthal sites reinforce this impression. Genetic evidence shows repeated interaction between Neanderthal populations and early Homo sapiens groups over immense spans of time. Humans carrying Neanderthal ancestry eventually spread across Eurasia, while some ancient African populations also preserve signals of interaction with deeply divergent human groups. The clean separation once imagined between distinct human species increasingly dissolves under the weight of the evidence. Krapina anticipated this collapse of categories long before genetics existed, because the bones themselves already revealed a confusing blend of traits. There is another reason Krapina remains strangely under-discussed, despite its enormous importance. The site challenges emotionally satisfying narratives about human uniqueness. Many people prefer a sharp dividing line between modern humans and earlier populations because such divisions create a simple story of progress and superiority. Krapina refuses that simplicity. The people there looked human in some ways and deeply archaic in others. They displayed symbolic behavior, yet also intense bodily violence. They hunted successfully, adapted to changing climates, manipulated ornaments, and cared for group identity, yet their cave also filled with broken human bones. The result feels uncomfortably familiar. That familiarity becomes even stronger when one studies the reconstructed faces derived from Krapina skulls. Some individuals possess features that modern observers would instantly recognize as human. The eyes, forehead contours, jawlines, and expressions feel close rather than distant. This is precisely why Krapina disturbed many early scholars after its discovery. The fossils looked too human to dismiss, yet too archaic to comfortably absorb into existing categories. Gorjanović-Kramberger himself recognized the tension. His reports repeatedly emphasized evolutionary transformation rather than static racial types. In this sense, Krapina helped push paleoanthropology toward a far more dynamic understanding of human evolution. Modern reconstructions of Neanderthal history increasingly support that dynamic picture. Europe during the late Pleistocene contained shifting populations that expanded, fragmented, reunited, and mixed repeatedly as climates changed. Cold periods isolated groups in southern refuges. Warm intervals reopened migration routes. Genetic exchange followed environmental change. Populations moved across river systems, coastlines, and mountain corridors in waves stretching across thousands of years. Krapina existed within that immense process rather than outside it. The cave therefore stands as something larger than a fossil site. It preserves a snapshot of humanity during one of its most unstable and transformative periods. The people at Krapina belong neither fully to the ancient past nor fully to the modern world. They occupied an in-between condition where older human forms and emerging populations still overlapped across Eurasia. Their anatomy reflects that overlap. Their behavior reflects that overlap. Even the violence within the cave reflects the pressures created by populations competing, mixing, and adapting within changing Ice Age landscapes. One final detail from the original reports carries unusual power because it reveals how shocking the site appeared to its discoverers. Gorjanovich-Kramberger described the cave as containing a whole prehistoric settlement, filled with traces of life, death, tools, animals, fire, and human activity layered together within the deposits. He understood immediately that he was not uncovering a monster or primitive beast. He was uncovering society itself in ancient form. That realization still echoes through the cave at Krapina today. Beneath the sandstone hill lie fragments of dozens of people who hunted, fought, decorated themselves, raised children, and struggled through changing climates long before written history existed. Their bones carry signs of brutality, adaptation, and survival. Their anatomy refuses clean classification. Their genetic legacy still survives within millions of living humans. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the closer science moves toward them, the harder it becomes to maintain the comforting distance that once separated modern humanity from the ancient people of Krapina. Thank you for watching. If this journey into the ancient world of Krapina brought new perspective to human origins and the tangled story of our Ice Age ancestors, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Human evolution grows more complex with every discovery, and some of the most important clues still sit buried beneath old caves, forgotten hillsides, and shattered bones, waiting for someone to notice that something never quite fit the official story.